The drug company Johnson & Johnson has a stellar reputation, but for years it sold baby powder containing asbestos. This is the People's Pharmacy with Terry and Joe Graydon.
Investigative journalist Gardiner Harris has taken a deep dive into the business practices of Johnson & Johnson.
What would happen at Johnson & Johnson is, as they descended into really terribly unethical practices, the company ended up becoming the crucial actor in the three largest, costliest, and deadliest criminal conspiracies in American history.
Coming up on the People's Pharmacy, uncovering the dark secrets of Johnson & Johnson.
In the People's Pharmacy Health Headlines, older people are not immune from the negative effects of consuming ultra-processed foods. A study published in the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition followed nearly 5,000 middle-aged and older adults for about 6 years. At the beginning of the study, they filled out detailed dietary questionnaires. In addition, they took cognitive tests every 2 years. The scientists report that for every additional daily serving of ultra-processed meats, like pepperoni or bacon, the chance that cognitive scores would slip increased by 17%. Ultra-processed beverages such as soft drinks also increased the likelihood of cognitive decline. Oddly, however, other ultra-processed food categories such as ready-to-eat meals or savory snacks were not associated with the risk for cognitive impairment.
The VITAL trial tested omega-3 fatty acids against placebo for more than 5 years. More than 25,000 older Americans volunteered as participants. Previous analyses of the results showed that the cardiovascular results were not statistically significant. A new analysis, taking prior probability into account, found that omega-3 fatty acids had a powerful positive effect on heart health. People taking 1 gram a day of fish oil were 7 to 12% less likely to develop coronary heart disease and 10 to 18% less likely to have a heart attack. Fish oil supplementation did not, however, reduce the risk of strokes.
Older people who like coffee may as well indulge. A study published in the European Journal of Nutrition found that those drinking 4 to 6 cups a day were less likely to become frail during the study. To draw this conclusion, scientists analyzed the data from the Longitudinal Aging Study Amsterdam. This research included more than 1,100 Dutch people at least 55 years old for 7 years. The coffee cups were European cups of 125 milliliters. That's just over 4 ounces. Frailty was determined when a person showed 3 or more of the following symptoms: weight loss, slow walking speed, reduced physical activity, weakness, or exhaustion. The researchers suggest that coffee reduces inflammation, increases insulin sensitivity, and bolsters muscle. That may be why higher coffee consumption on a regular basis is associated with lower odds of frailty. The researchers expressed the need for more studies to investigate possible underlying mechanisms by which coffee might influence frailty development.
Most nutrition experts would frown at the idea that fat could help people manage their weight. But a new study published in the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition found that a long-term increase in olive oil consumption was associated with weight loss. Other fats, such as margarine or butter, however, were linked to weight gain. These data were derived from more than 120,000 middle-aged health professionals who participated in the Nurses' Health Study and the Health Professionals Follow-Up Study. The authors conclude that their findings reinforce the benefits of olive oil even for people outside the Mediterranean region. According to the authors, this evidence highlights the potential importance of dietary fat quality and sources for long-term weight control, as well as risk of cardiometabolic diseases.
Intestinal infections with Clostridioides difficile are hard to treat because they tend to come back, even after a person has completed a full course of antibiotics. A team of researchers has just tested the effectiveness of supplying fecal microbiota via colonoscopy to prevent recurrent infections. They used a concoction of live fecal microbiota called Rebiota. The FDA approved this treatment for preventing recurrent C. diff infections. The volunteers had suffered an average of 3 previous C. diff episodes for which they had taken some powerful antibiotics. At 6 months, 95% of the participants were judged to have had successful treatment without recurrence. The side effects were primarily digestive in nature, and the treating physicians characterized them as mild. And that's the health news from the People's Pharmacy this week. Welcome to the People's Pharmacy. I'm Terry Graydon.
And I'm Joe Graydon. The Johnson & Johnson Company was founded in 1886 and initially created sterile surgical supplies. The J&J Pharmaceutical Company eventually developed some of the most respected brands in America. First and foremost is Tylenol. The slogan, "Trust Tylenol, hospitals do," has been reassuring.
Johnson & Johnson may be even better known for its baby powder. The fragrance is so familiar, and like the Tylenol slogan, it's reassuring. The company promotes its commitment to social responsibility and innovation.
Our guest today has a slightly different perspective on this pharmaceutical powerhouse. Gardiner Harris previously served as the public health and pharmaceutical reporter for the New York Times and is now a freelance investigative journalist. He was also a reporter for the Wall Street Journal covering the pharmaceutical industry. He won the Robert Worth Bingham Prize for Investigative Journalism and the George Polk Award for Environmental Reporting after revealing that coal companies deliberately and illegally exposed miners to toxic levels of coal dust. His latest book is No More Tears: The Dark Secrets of Johnson & Johnson.
Welcome to the People's Pharmacy, Gardiner Harris.
I'm glad to be here, Terry.
Gardiner, I have a confession. We have been following your investigative journalism for decades, first at the New York Times, then at the Wall Street Journal. Your coverage of the pharmaceutical industry has been a beacon for those of us who also report on the drug industry. So you have taken on a huge task. Why did you decide to do such a deep dive into Johnson & Johnson in particular?
Well, I'm glad to be here, Joe, and thanks for complimenting my coverage over the years. As you guys know, I covered the entire industry, and Johnson & Johnson is unique, and it always puzzled me on the beat of how different it was. On the one hand, it is by far the most admired drug company in the world. As other drug companies started declining in admiration, particularly amongst the American public, Johnson & Johnson stayed always near the top of the most admired lists all over the world. Nonetheless, Johnson & Johnson, in my judgment, was by far the worst behaved of the many pharmaceutical companies in the world. It presided over disaster after disaster after disaster, and yet none of that behavior seemed to affect the way people saw it. And you may remember I did several stories about particular difficulties that Johnson & Johnson underwent. And I would hear from readers, well, Gardiner, they might have made a mistake here, but Johnson & Johnson is famously a great company. People knew that it had this mission statement that Johnson & Johnson calls the credo. People knew about the 1982 Tylenol poisoning case. So nothing ever dented this image. And so I thought it was important to sort of put together an entire package of stories about how Johnson & Johnson behaved with its consumer products, with its pharmaceutical products, with its medical device products. The other reason that I thought this was important is that Johnson & Johnson is the most important company in our world in the healthcare products space, in a way that, say, Purdue Pharma was never a particularly important company, was never a big company. So when you write about Johnson & Johnson, you are in many ways writing about American healthcare writ large.
Well, and in fact, you suggest that it was considered a quintessentially American company. I think for listeners, let's just mention a few of the most famous products that they might recognize so we have some idea of, who we're talking about here.
Sure, they make Tylenol, they make Aveeno, they make all kinds of Johnson's baby powder, Johnson's baby oil, all of the baby products there were historically part of Johnson and Johnson. They make some huge selling drugs. They are the largest medical device maker. If you have a new hip, if you have a new knee, there's a very good chance that Johnson & Johnson made those things. If you have ever had surgery and gotten your wounds stitched up, there's about a 70% chance that the sutures that were used are from Johnson & Johnson. Johnson & Johnson started really as a hospital supply company. It remains one of the largest suppliers of basic hospital supplies around the world.
Now, as you mentioned, Johnson & Johnson made, famously, baby powder. What made the J&J baby powder such an iconic brand?
So around the end of World War I, Johnson & Johnson, which had been supplying the Allies with bandages and all kinds of needs for battle, realized that its huge bandages supply business was likely to go away with the end of the war. So Johnson & Johnson realized it needed to start focusing on consumer products. And the first consumer product it decided had the most potential was Johnson's baby powder. It had launched Johnson's baby powder in 1894 because Johnson & Johnson actually originally made plaster casts, which were these strange kind of hybrid cast / bandage that doctors in the 19th century used a lot of. And Johnson & Johnson made the best plaster casts. In fact, they started using rubber. They were the first to really do that. But some of their casts caused serious skin irritation. So with certain plaster casts, they would send out a tiny little tin of talc to improve skin feeling. And then people just started asking for the talc, and they realized they had a business. So they launched Johnson's baby powder. And in 1918, with the end of World War I, and also the end, remember, of the Spanish flu, for which Johnson & Johnson was also a huge supplier of masks, Johnson & Johnson decided we're going to do a huge marketing campaign for Johnson's baby powder. They invested millions and millions of dollars in ads. This product became widely known around the world, and it was then that Johnson & Johnson really recast its own image as that of a baby company. And that image of a baby company has lasted to this day.
Well, I think almost everybody remembers that smell because it's so powerful in our memories, in our minds. Tell us when Johnson & Johnson first realized they might have a problem with baby powder.
Right. So I tell the story of baby powder in the beginning of the book, and it really becomes the ladder down which Johnson & Johnson, which had been a very ethical company, descends into really bad behavior. And once they start realizing that Johnson's baby powder has asbestos in it, in those early years, you can sort of imagine the executives saying, oh, we only have a little bit of asbestos in Johnson's baby powder. And in the 50s and 60s, when they first realized this, asbestos was everywhere in American society. There wasn't a boat, a plane, a car, even a house in the country that didn't have some asbestos in it. And indeed, many of these places had pure asbestos in it. You may remember in the original Wizard of Oz, the scene where snow starts to fall on the poppies. That snow in the movie studio was asbestos. In the 1950s, many of us decorated our Christmas trees with fake snow. The original fake snow was pure asbestos. So there was asbestos everywhere in American society. But studies start coming out in the late 1950s, in the early 1960s, that show asbestos may be the most dangerous mineral that the Earth produces for humans, because what distinguishes asbestos is that its particles are so small and so sharp. This is why asbestos could actually be formed into a cloth. It was the strangest of minerals, asbestos is, because you can actually weave this mineral into cloths, into many other things. And so, but that extraordinary quality actually makes it unbelievably dangerous for humans, because the particles are so small and so sharp, they actually spear DNA. So when you breathe it in, it can lead to genetic changes that lead to cancer. But the problem with asbestos is that the latency period for asbestos, which means the time between you are exposed to asbestos and you get cancer, can be 10, 20, 30, and even 40 years. And that's why it's so frightening, because you can have even the tiniest of exposures, microscopic amounts of asbestos, and that can lead to cancer immediately or 40 years later.
You're listening to investigative journalist Gardiner Harris. He has written for both the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times. He won the Robert Worth Bingham Prize for Investigative Journalism and the George Polk Award for Environmental Reporting. His latest book is No More Tears: The Dark Secrets of Johnson & Johnson.
We contacted Johnson & Johnson for their response and did not hear back. After the break, we'll learn more about the problem of asbestos in baby powder.
This was a huge risk for J&J. How did they try to deal with it?
What was the FDA telling J&J about the amount of asbestos in its baby powder?
Other companies switched to cornstarch. Why didn't Johnson & Johnson do that at the same time?
Baby powder was not the only problem. Johnson & Johnson was also involved in the opioid crisis.
You're listening to The People's Pharmacy with Joe and Terry Graydon.
Welcome back to the People's Pharmacy. I'm Joe Graydon.
I'm Terry Graydon. Johnson & Johnson has prided itself on its quality products. When did the company realize that its iconic baby powder contained asbestos? When other companies started switching to cornstarch, what did J&J do?
We reached out to Johnson & Johnson for their response to our guest's book. We've not heard back.
Our guest today is Gardiner Harris, an investigative journalist who has written for both the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times. He's now a freelance reporter. His latest book is No More Tears: The Dark Secrets of Johnson & Johnson.
Gardiner, so it turns out that the baby powder that Johnson & Johnson was selling and that was so widely used and successful was contaminated with something called asbestos. When did J&J first realize that it had an asbestos problem and that there was a potential for litigation, and how did they deal with that?
So talc and asbestos are chemically identical, which means that there isn't a talc deposit in the world that doesn't have a little bit of asbestos in it. And there isn't an asbestos deposit in the world that doesn't have a little bit of talc in it, because these chemicals just need a little differences in pressure and time to become either asbestos or talc. In the 1950s and the 1960s, Johnson & Johnson started to get worried about this, initially because asbestos is a little bit grittier than talc, and they wanted people to have a very smooth feeling with Johnson's baby powder. So they sent their powder around to labs, and their labs told them, well, if you could get out a little bit more asbestos, that might make it feel a little bit better. In the 1960s, executives realized that they might actually have a real problem from a health perspective, because it was in the 1960s that scientists around the world started seeing what were called domestic exposure cases of asbestos. So we've known for 200 years that minerals, if you breathe them as the miner in large amounts, can cause all kinds of lung problems. This is black lung for coal miners. Those who worked in looms got a kind of lung disease from breathing too much cotton. But asbestos uniquely causes problems even in people who breathe very little amounts of it. And scientists started documenting cases of, say, women whose only exposure to asbestos was washing their husband's clothes, and their husband was exposed to asbestos at work, or others whose only exposure to asbestos was living a few miles downwind from an asbestos mine. These were tiny, tiny exposures, and people would get something called mesothelioma, which is a cancer of the lining of the lung that is only caused by asbestos exposure.
So how did J&J deal with what was perhaps a huge risk, both health-wise and financially?
Johnson & Johnson realized that some of its talc mines in the United States seemed to have more asbestos in it than others. So in the mid-1960s, Johnson & Johnson actually sold off one of its talc mines in a place called Johnson, Vermont, not far from Burlington, Vermont, because the talc deposit there was really ribboned with a lot of asbestos. It kept the mines in southern Vermont, which seemed to have less asbestos in it. It also started discussions internally about what it might do, and it began to have discussions with FDA about how to protect people against excessive amounts of asbestos in its baby powder. But its officials basically told FDA in the 1970s that it would be impossible for them to completely eliminate asbestos from its talc products. But again, in the early 1970s, there still was a lot of asbestos around in American society. And so the amounts of asbestos in Johnson's baby powder were in the 1% to 3% range, which Johnson & Johnson kept telling FDA was fine. Don't worry about it. These are tiny exposures.
And Gardner, what did FDA say in return?
Well, the FDA responded, look, no one is going to want to dust their baby with 1% of a known carcinogen. You're crazy if you think that that is acceptable. So FDA tried to set up a very tough testing standard that would have limited talc products to less than 0.1% asbestos. Johnson & Johnson immediately realized that this would be huge trouble for them, that they would never be able to meet that standard. So Johnson & Johnson got together with other talc manufacturers and told FDA, no way. That standard is too tough. You can't do it. And FDA does most of its regulatory oversight in collaboration with industry. And when industry said no, FDA buckled. And Johnson & Johnson then came up with a testing standard for talc that would certify talc as being asbestos-free, even if it had up to 3% asbestos.
Whew. But in hindsight, other companies switched to cornstarch. Why didn't J&J do that?
So that's a really good question. And that question became even more urgent in the early 1980s as a scientist from Harvard did the first epidemiological study where he looked at health records of women who used talc regularly and compared them with health records of women who didn't use talc regularly. And he found that women who used talc regularly had about 60% more likelihood of getting ovarian cancer than women who didn't. It was an enormous difference from an epidemiological standpoint. And it was at that moment, really, that Johnson & Johnson had this really important decision to make. And all talc manufacturers had the same decision to make. Stay with talc or transition to cornstarch. Most other manufacturers, Pfizer, Colgate, many others, switched entirely to cornstarch. After all, baby powder has no medical benefit. Why even risk the smallest chance that it could lead to cancer? But Johnson & Johnson has long been very stubborn. It does not make changes according to what critics and consumer groups want it to do. And Johnson & Johnson saw themselves as a uniquely beneficial force in the world. So Johnson & Johnson, instead of making this switch to cornstarch, stuck with talc and created a committee inside of scientists, lawyers, and others to basically attack every scientific study and any critic from there on out who suggested that talcum powder would be dangerous.
Fast forward to lawsuits, because a lot of women were affected. And I'm curious how J&J responded to those lawsuits and what it actually admitted when it came to the issue of talc and asbestos.
So Johnson & Johnson used talc not only in Johnson's baby powder and some other cosmetic products, but since it owned these huge mines, it sold talc for industrial purposes, mostly in tire plants. As you know, when you buy an inner tube for your bike, there's a little white powder in there. That's talc. And it used to be that tire plants in the United States were swimming in clouds of talc. So the first people who first started filing suit against Johnson & Johnson and other talc producers were workers at tire plants. And the first lawsuit that was filed came in the late 1970s. And the lawyer for that tire worker got all of these files from Johnson & Johnson and a talc company that had bought its mine in Johnson, Vermont. And that company had actually done test after test after test of its talc and shown that there was huge amounts of asbestos in it. And not only that, but they had taken talc from lots of other companies to compare their own, and they had found asbestos in all of the other talcs as well. So Johnson & Johnson's attorneys got involved in this lawsuit, and the lawyer actually deposed the research director of this company, who admitted that they had found all kinds of asbestos. So what they did was they settled this case. They got all the records that had come out of this deposition, and they hid them in a warehouse that no one then knew where those records had come from. And Johnson & Johnson and talc companies for 25 years lied in court, often under oath, saying that they had never found asbestos in their talc products, that no test had ever shown asbestos, and they ended up getting thousands upon thousands of lawsuits dismissed. This was a clear crime, and that crime finally fell apart in around 2012 when the daughter of one of those who had worked in the lab got cancer, filed suit, and deposed her own father, who said that all of these records had been taken from the labs and sent off to a warehouse where they had never been seen since. And after her deposition, lawyers had to search all of these warehouses, and they started finding all of these old records that showed that asbestos had actually been in talc and baby powder for years and years and years and years. Those records then finally got in the hands of an attorney named Mark Lanier. He sued on behalf of 22 women with ovarian cancer, and a jury in St. Louis awarded those women $4.7 billion. It was the largest single award in a product liability case in American history. Judges eventually reduced it, but finally, after Johnson & Johnson's appeals all failed, the company had to transfer to that lawyer $2.5 billion. And it was that case that would lead Johnson & Johnson to start an entirely new strategy, which involved bankruptcy.
So where are we today as far as litigation is concerned, and is talc gone from Johnson & Johnson baby powder?
So as a result of that trial, FDA became aware that there had been evidence for decades that Johnson's baby powder had asbestos in it. Now, it will shock you to know that since 1973, Johnson & Johnson had not forwarded a single one of its tests of baby powder to the FDA. So FDA was completely unaware that Johnson & Johnson had known throughout this time that Johnson's baby powder was contaminated. So the FDA decided to do its own test of Johnson's baby powder in 2019. And what happened? The FDA found asbestos in Johnson's baby powder. After the FDA announced this, Johnson & Johnson claimed that FDA had gotten its test wrong. I actually have documents from the internal conversations within Johnson & Johnson in which they talked about blackmail, coercion, all kinds of threats. In depositions, Johnson & Johnson executives say they can't remember what they were talking about when they were talking about blackmail. But finally, Johnson & Johnson decided they had to withdraw talc-based baby powder from the American market a year later. And then 2 years later, they withdrew talc-based baby powder from the entire world. So Johnson & Johnson is now producing Johnson's baby powder only with cornstarch. Although if you go online to Amazon and other retailers, you can still buy talc-based baby powder.
How many lawsuits are there, and what is the latest status?
93,000 people have sued Johnson & Johnson over Johnson's baby powder. The most recent bankruptcy petition that Johnson & Johnson filed to get rid of all these claims was dismissed by a federal judge in Houston. So Johnson & Johnson has vowed to fight all of these lawsuits one by one in courts across the country.
Gardiner, I'd like you to talk a little bit about the opioid debacle. We always think about Purdue, Frederick, and their mess.
Sure.
But Johnson & Johnson had its finger in the fentanyl pie, too. How did that happen?
So there's been 3 opioid crises, right? The first was the prescription opioid crisis, where people died because of prescriptions from their doctors. Right now, we're in the Mexican fentanyl crisis. In the original prescription crisis, the story has always been told to you that it was Purdue Pharma and OxyContin that caused all that. In fact, around 10 to 20% of the bodies that showed up in morgues had a Purdue Pharma product in their system. 60% had a Johnson & Johnson product in their system. Johnson & Johnson was at least as responsible as Purdue Pharma, and that was for several reasons. First, Johnson & Johnson supplied most of the opioid ingredients in the US market to multiple manufacturers. One of them was Purdue Pharma. Purdue Pharma could never have sold OxyContin without its partnership to Johnson & Johnson. That's because Johnson & Johnson has this huge opioid production facility in Tasmania, the island off of the Australian continent. Johnson & Johnson also sold its own branded opioids, including fentanyl. It discovered fentanyl back in the early 1960s, and for years it sold a fentanyl patch and called Duragesic. And it, in fact, copied the Purdue playbook by selling fentanyl as a non-addicting alternative to OxyContin. Nowadays, we all know what fentanyl is, and it's laughable to claim that fentanyl is non-addictive. We all know that it's addictive. But back in the 1990s and 2000s, fentanyl was not nearly as known, and Johnson & Johnson told doctors that if they wanted to protect their patients from addiction, they should give them fentanyl. And its fentanyl patches sales soared as a result of that false and illegal message.
You're listening to Gardiner Harris, investigative journalist. He's written for both the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times. He won the Robert Worth Bingham Prize for Investigative Journalism and the George Polk Award for Environmental Reporting. His latest book is No More Tears: The Dark Secrets of Johnson & Johnson.
It's time for a short break. When we come back, we'll get a short summary of J&J's business practices and the products it makes.
No doubt you've used one of its most popular products, the pain reliever Tylenol.
Beyond Tylenol, there are medications like Risperdal, Haldol, and fentanyl.
How were these products marketed?
We'll also discuss how user fees affect the FDA's ability to regulate medicines.
You're listening to The People's Pharmacy with Joe and Terry Graydon.
Welcome back to The People's Pharmacy. I'm Joe Graydon.
And I'm Terry Graydon. Johnson & Johnson says that it has been dedicated to corporate social responsibility since before such a concept became popular. The company maintains that this credo serves as a moral compass as well as a recipe for business success.
Our guest today is challenging some of the company's business practices, including its marketing of baby powder as well as the powerful pain reliever fentanyl. Gardiner Harris is an investigative journalist who has reported on public health and pharmaceuticals for the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal. His investigations there led to what was then the largest fine in the history of the Securities and Exchange Commission. He's currently a freelance journalist. His latest book is No More Tears: The Dark Secrets of Johnson & Johnson. Our producer reached out to Johnson & Johnson to offer the company a chance to respond. She's not heard back.
Gardner, can you give us a summary of the state of Johnson & Johnson's business and business practices?
And as you do that, Gardner, I mean, clearly baby powder was huge.
Right.
But Tylenol is right up there with baby powder as one of the most trusted brands in the world. So start with Tylenol and work your way through.
Sure. Here's what I would say about, so Johnson's baby powder was really the most iconic product. And what happened is that as executives realized that they were truly selling this terribly contaminated product, it led to a whole host of other deeply problematic behavior. And what would happen at Johnson and Johnson is, as they descended into really terribly unethical practices, the company ended up becoming the crucial actor in the three largest, costliest, and deadliest criminal conspiracies in American history. Collectively, I have epidemiologists who estimate that these three crimes cost more than 2 million American lives. And the first of these crimes is, of course, the opioid crisis. You think that Purdue Pharma and the Sacklers were the sole and most important contributors to that. That's not true. The fact that so few people understand that Johnson and Johnson was at least as much to blame for that shows just how powerful this company is. The third massive criminal conspiracy, and one that cost far more lives than opioids, is the antipsychotic crisis, particularly in American nursing homes. And the fourth was EPO in cancer. But as you say, Tylenol is really important in this story as well. Tylenol has been for decades the most widely used drug in the United States. And what so few people understand, because Johnson and Johnson's advertising for Tylenol centers around the safety, right? The one hospitals use the most, the one doctors recommend the most, is that Tylenol is actually the most dangerous over-the-counter medicine sold in the world, and nothing else is even close. And the reason for that is that Tylenol's recommended dose is the same as the maximum dose. And it is the only over-the-counter medicine that is sold like that.
So let's go into a little bit more detail on that, if you don't mind. So you're saying the recommended dose and the maximum dose, there's no wiggle room there. So what happens if someone goes over that maximum dose by accident, which does happen?
Sure. So the problem with Tylenol and its constituent medicine, which is acetaminophen, is that it doesn't actually work very well at low doses. Regular Tylenol, for instance, is only mildly effective. So Johnson & Johnson realized that the very safety and the mild impact of Tylenol were both the best thing about Tylenol, but also the worst thing. So that's why Johnson & Johnson launched in 1976 extra strength Tylenol, which has 500 milligrams of acetaminophen. Now, 500 milligrams, 2 of those capsules or pills, is the maximum dose of acetaminophen that you should take over a 6-hour period. If you take anything more, it can have very deleterious effects on your liver. And this is particularly true if you drink a regular amount of alcohol in the United States. The usual amount is 2 drinks a night. And I'm not saying drinking alcohol while taking Tylenol, but rather if you just drink alcohol in your life, you get sick. Take Tylenol, there's a chance that even the recommended dose of Tylenol could do damage to your liver. The real problem also with Tylenol is that acetaminophen is in so many different products. Cold and cough medicines often have acetaminophen in it. So people will take Tylenol and then they'll take a cough and cold medicine, not realizing that they are doubling up on their dose of acetaminophen. The symptoms of Tylenol poisoning are the same symptoms as the flu. So as people start feeling sicker, they often start taking that much more Tylenol, which poisons their liver that much more, which is why Tylenol is the most common cause of liver failure in the United States.
We could spend time talking about the antidote, something called NAC and acetylcysteine, and why the company never put that together with acetaminophen. But I'd like to move on to some of the other drugs.
Sure.
So, for example, Risperdal, fentanyl, and Haldol. Tell us a little bit about these drugs and why you have written about them in your book.
So Risperdal is really the first great atypical antipsychotic. And what that is an entire class of medicines that are really meant to treat schizophrenia. Antipsychotics are the only drugs that seem to cut down on hallucinations. Unfortunately for Johnson and Johnson, there aren't that many schizophrenics around in the United States. They represent less than 1% of the population. So to boost sales, Johnson and Johnson started selling it to both the elderly and to children. And both of those groups were illegal for them to market this drug to. In the elderly, they decided to target patients with dementia. Now, patients with dementia who are given Risperdal suffer far greater heart attacks, strokes, and respiratory infections than those who are not given Risperdal. But nursing homes use a lot of antipsychotics because it makes their wards much quieter at night. Essentially, these homes are using these drugs as chemical straitjackets. And Johnson & Johnson did an illegal campaign to encourage that. And in fact,
So Gardner, if I may
Yeah.
interrupt, I'm sorry. You did say illegal, and I'd like to know what made it illegal.
The FDA had told Johnson & Johnson, do not market this for dementia because it doesn't help dementia patients cognitively, and it actually kills them. In fact, the FDA required Johnson & Johnson to put the starkest warning label on a widely used drug ever, which Risperdal now has, a black box warning that says this is not only not indicated for dementia, meaning it doesn't help dementia patients, but it can kill them. And what Johnson & Johnson did was to quietly reassure doctors, first, no one is going to catch you if you kill your patients with Risperdal because patients will die from heart attacks and strokes. And that's what they might die of anyway. The second thing Johnson & Johnson's sales reps told doctors was that if you want to avoid scrutiny, start diagnosing your dementia patients as having what they called late onset schizophrenia. Now, as you both know, there is no such thing as late onset schizophrenia. If you get schizophrenia, you get it in your late teens and early 20s. If you don't get it then, you're never going to get it. But Johnson & Johnson was so successful in this illegal scheme that to this day, 1 in 9 nursing home patients in the United States are diagnosed with late onset schizophrenia, and 21% of patients in American nursing homes are given Risperdal or similar medicines.
Even though this medicine could be killing them.
Even though this medicine is killing them. I got a epidemiological analysis showing that roughly 60,000 American nursing home patients die because they are given Risperdal and similar medicines. And by the way, remember in COVID-19 how American nursing homes in particular were devastated by the infections and the deaths, much more so than nursing homes elsewhere in the world. And that may be because American nursing homes use Risperdal much more than nursing homes elsewhere. And remember, one of the ways that Risperdal kills you is by making you far more susceptible to respiratory infections. What is COVID-19? It is a respiratory infection.
Tell us why you are concerned about J&J promoting the use of Risperdal in children. Why would children be prescribed Risperdal?
So the biggest psychological diagnosis in children is something called defiance disorder and ADHD. You know all these, and it's basically when kids act out. And it's a huge market. And children who act out or are violent are now often sent to psychiatrists. And the most effective way of stopping that kind of acting out is to give those kids Risperdal or a similar antipsychotic, because it instantly makes them sleepy, makes them queasy, makes them feel sick. And kids who are sleepy, queasy, and sick tend not to act out nearly as much. Unfortunately, it also leads them to gain huge amounts of weight, roughly 1.5 to 2 pounds every week. So 6 months of therapy on these drugs can lead children to become massively obese. And in the case of Risperdal, it causes roughly 10% of boys to grow female breasts. These breasts are permanent. Even if you stop the drug, they still have breasts. And it causes girls to express milk, to lactate from their breasts. And when you have a 10-year-old girl suddenly lactating milk, it is a frightening situation. Now, Johnson & Johnson knew about these risks, kept them secret, and told psychiatrists to prescribe Risperdal to children anyway. It was clearly illegal, and Johnson & Johnson later pleaded guilty to criminal charges and paid a $2.2 billion fine because of its marketing for Risperdal. But it was too late for 50, 60,000 boys who grew breasts as a result.
Gardner, I would like to ask you about the relationship between the FDA and drug companies in general, and as well as J&J in particular. You have suggested that the FDA has become captive of the industry it's trying to regulate. And that presumably is because of PDUFA, the Prescription Drug User Fee Act,
Right.
which means that anytime a drug company wants to get the FDA to approve a drug, they pay the FDA. It definitely suggests that the FDA is dependent on pharmaceutical companies for its budget. Why would it be better for taxpayers to actually fund our regulatory drug agency?
So what happened was that in the late 1980s and the early 1990s, FDA was not getting enough money from Congress. And the result was that its drug approvals had gotten slower and slower and slower. The average drug approval time in the late 1980s and early 90s was around 26 months. So many drugs were approved in Europe before the United States. This was called the drug lag. And people in the industry and conservatives generally were decrying this problem. And in fact, the AIDS crisis came along, and even AIDS advocates were screaming about the delay in getting these life-saving medicines. And in fact, ACT UP, the famous AIDS advocacy organization, famously staged a rally outside of FDA headquarters and splashed what looked like blood on FDA's walls. So FDA knew that it had to speed up, but they knew at the time that Congress was not going to give them money. So the commissioner at the time, David Kessler, made a deal with the industry in 1992 to accept fees from drug makers and in return promise much faster reviews. And each one of those deals lasted 5 years. So the first deal was in 92, the next one in 97, the third one in 2002. But with each one of those deals, the industry got more and more and more concessions. In fact, just before signing deals, industry executives would go into the FDA and kind of kick the tires and see what other parts of FDA they wanted to essentially co-opt. And what has happened over the 33 years since is that essentially all of FDA has been sold off to the industry. And now the FDA essentially does exactly what the industry wants them to do and doesn't do anything that the industry doesn't want them to do. The reason why the opioid crisis took off is that FDA no longer allows its criminal investigators to really investigate big drug makers anymore. So all of the crimes that have come out of the opioid crisis, out of the antipsychotic, all these things are not because FDA investigated them. Rather, it's because whistleblowers took these cases to U.S. attorneys' offices across the country. So what has happened to FDA is that it has become entirely captive to the industry it regulates. And you can see this in the history of Johnson & Johnson, where each one of these disasters I relate was entirely enabled by a feckless FDA.
Just out of curiosity, Gardner, how much of the FDA's budget comes from the pharmaceutical industry?
So the drug center at the FDA that oversees pharmaceutical industry gets about 2/3 of its budget from user fees. The FDA writ large, which includes the food part of the FDA that doesn't have user fees, the entire budget of the FDA is 49% underwritten by user fees. But the drug center and the device center, which are most closely associated with medical product approvals, get about 2/3 of their money from user fees.
Gardner Harris, you mention a drug called Procrit, EPO. Tell us what it is and why it too created so much, I would say, controversy and consternation.
And death. EPO, most people know EPO because Lance Armstrong and his team used it to dope to win 7 Tours de France. EPO is a blood thickener. It spurs your body to create red blood cells, which is why it's so good for aerobic athletes. Johnson & Johnson's idea was that it would also be good for cancer patients because it would just sort of be a general pick-me-up for those taking intense chemotherapy. But the company knew from the beginning that EPO also had a much darker side, and that is that it's miracle grow to tumors. It actually spurs tumors growth. Now, Johnson & Johnson kept that knowledge secret and started selling EPO to cancer patients in the early 1990s. They were so successful that EPO quickly became the most widely used drug in cancer. And through the administrations of Bill Clinton and George W. Bush, millions of cancer patients were given EPO. And an epidemiological analysis that I have seen suggests about 500,000 cancer patients lost their lives because Johnson & Johnson spurred doctors to use EPO in cancer patients and kept secret that it would actually kill them.
Gardner, we're just about out of time, and we've only scratched the surface. There are a number of other issues you had mentioned: fentanyl, there's vaginal mesh, there are hip implants.
Sure.
But there's the whole issue around the relationship between drug companies and the FDA through user fees and all those darn commercials for prescription drugs that are only here and in New Zealand. Can you kind of put this all in perspective for us, please?
Sure. What the story of Johnson & Johnson shows is just how corrupt the American healthcare system is all across the board. The story shows that doctors, many of them are taking money from Johnson & Johnson and other drug makers and prescribing drugs and medical devices in really dangerous ways. It also shows that the FDA is actually being paid by Johnson & Johnson, and as a result, has over the last 30 years become entirely captive to Johnson & Johnson and other drug companies. And it shows even that such things as the most admired cancer hospitals have actually used Johnson & Johnson drugs in truly dangerous ways because it was so incredibly profitable for them to do so. So the point of the book is so that you can start protecting yourself and your family by understanding how the system operates. in countless areas. That's why I have so many products, because I want you to see how each part of the healthcare system operates in when you get a new hip, when you get a new knee, when you have vaginal problems, when you get contraceptives, in place after place, doctor after doctor, and even in a trusted organization like the FDA, Johnson & Johnson manages to undermine the system in a way that endangers your life, those of your children, and those of your parents. And reading this book, I'm hoping, will allow you to do some protective work to keep yourself safe.
Gardiner Harris, thank you so much for writing No More Tears, and thank you for talking with us today on the People's Pharmacy.
Terry and Joe, I'm thrilled that you had me. Thanks so much.
You've been listening to Gardiner Harris. He previously served as the public health and pharmaceutical reporter for the New York Times. He's now a freelance investigative journalist. He also served as a White House, South Asia, and international diplomacy reporter for the Times. Before that, he was a reporter for the Wall Street Journal, covering the pharmaceutical industry. His investigations there led to what was then the largest fine in the history of the Securities and Exchange Commission. He won the Robert Worth Bingham Prize for Investigative Journalism and the George Polk Award for Environmental Reporting after revealing that coal companies deliberately and illegally exposed miners to toxic levels of coal dust. His latest book is No More Tears: The Dark Secrets of Johnson & Johnson.
Lynn Siegel produced today's show. She contacted Johnson & Johnson to offer the company a chance to comment. We've not heard back. Al Wodarski engineered. Dave Graydon edits our interviews. B.J. Liederman composed our theme music.
This show is a co-production of North Carolina Public Radio, WUNC, with the People's Pharmacy.
Today's show is number 1430. You can find it online at peoplespharmacy.com. That's where you can share your comments about today's interview. You can also reach us through email, radio@peoplespharmacy.com.
Our interviews are available through your favorite podcast provider. You'll find the podcast on our website on Monday morning. On this week's podcast, you'll learn more about the relationship between the FDA and the drug companies. Has the pharmaceutical industry captured its regulatory agency? You'll also learn about a drug J&J marketed for cancer patients that could make tumors worse.
At peoplespharmacy.com, you can sign up for our free online newsletter to get the latest news about important health stories. When you subscribe, you also have regular access to information about our weekly podcast, so you can find out ahead of time what topics we'll be covering. Speaking of the podcast, we would be so grateful if you would consider writing a review of the People's Pharmacy and posting it to the podcast platform you prefer. In Durham, North Carolina, I'm Joe Graydon.
And I'm Terry Graydon. Thank you for listening. Please join us again next week.